beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That verse and the chapter that follows may be one of the most highly debated passages in the Bible, at least in the Old Testament. The creation account in Genesis 1 has led to arguments over the relationship between religion and science, arguments over what the text means by a day. Instead, I'd like for us to think of it from the perspective of an ancient reader of Scripture. When an ancient Israelite read this text and read the descriptions of what God was creating the dry land, separating the waters, placing the sky, and then inhabiting those spaces with things like fish, birds, and stars, they would have recognized the similarities with other texts that describe the construction of temples. And so in a way, the story of Genesis 1 is God creating the heavens and the earth as His temple, and filling it with things like one would fill a church with pews and altars and confessionals. But there's one section of this story that has always struck me as odd. Day 7. The first 6 days, God is at work creating spaces, and then creating things to populate those spaces. But then day 7 rolls around, and it says, "And on the 7th day, God finished the work that He had done, and He rested on the 7th day from all the work that He had done. So God blessed the 7th day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all of the work that He had done in creation." Was God tired from the work of creating the heavens and the earth? Did the creativity needed to create the platypus really wear God out? If God is all-powerful, then the answer is certainly not. So something else must be going on. John Walton, in his book The Lost World of Genesis 1, helpfully points out for us that the gods in the ancient world were known to rest on occasion, but they only ever rested in one place, their temples. The creation account here in Genesis ends not with God lounging in heaven detached from what He had created, but inhabiting it, intimately involved with what He had just spoken into being. Therefore, the involvement of God with His creation does not end with day 6. Day 7 tells us that there will be a day 8, 9, and beyond. The creation story in Genesis 1, with its 6 days of work and 7th day of rest, sets the pattern for us of how God has created the world and humanity to function. Put another way, if humanity is to be the image of God, if humanity is to model their lives after the example set by God, this first week sets the pattern for how we are to balance our lives. This pattern of being is enshrined in the law, in the Torah, in several places, and the day of rest becomes known as the Sabbath. In both versions of the Ten Commandments, in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, the Sabbath is commanded to the Israelites as essential. They're told to remember or observe the Sabbath and to keep it holy. In Exodus 20, the people are instructed, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. And if it wasn't clear enough, the commandment is grounded in the imagery of Genesis 1. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and consecrated it. N.T. Wright suggests that as the temple is sacred space, the Sabbath is sacred time. As the story of Israel continues, we find that the Sabbath is not confined to the weekly happenings of the Israelites. As God gave the law to Moses on Sinai, we read in Leviticus 25 about the Sabbath year and the year of Jubilee. The Sabbath year was, unsurprisingly, every 7th year. The Sabbath year was a year of rest for the land. They were not to plant crops or prune their vineyards. The people were allowed to eat what the land produced during this year, but there's a sense that they were not to work the land. And the focus was not rest for themselves necessarily, but rest for the land. Lest the Israelites and the rest of us think that everything is about us, we're reminded that the created world participates in relationship with God as well. The description of the Sabbath year only takes up the first portion of Leviticus 25, continuing with the themes of sevens after every seventh Sabbath year, that is, every 50th year. The people were to have what was called a year of Jubilee. The year of Jubilee was like a special Sabbath year. In addition to giving the land rest and not planting crops, debts were forgiven. Those who were in need were to be supported by those in the community, and land that had been sold was to be returned to the original owner. In essence, the year of Jubilee is like a factory reset. There's a recognition that people fall on hard times and they're forced to take drastic measures such as selling their land, taking on debt, or entering into slavery. But the year of Jubilee reverses all of that. The people are restored back to wholeness. It may be tempting for us from a modern perspective to look back and point out how there's no evidence that the year of Jubilee was ever enacted in the life of Israel. Or we may be tempted to think of it as a requirement of a past age for a different people. But Jesus himself takes the ethics of the Sabbath and the year of Jubilee and places them at the center of what it means to be Christians. In Luke chapter 4, after being tempted by Satan, Jesus arrives in Nazareth and goes to the synagogue on the Sabbath. He reads from the scroll of Isaiah saying, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." He sits down and begins to teach from this text, saying, so there can be no confusion, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." This scripture, which proclaims the core of the Sabbath and year of Jubilee, that the people are made whole again, is embodied in Jesus. So we see this continuation of the Sabbath from the people of Israel to those who are followers of Christ. If the people of God want to truly model their lives after God, then they must pattern their lives after the Sabbath. My wife's birthday is coming up. Her birthday is actually on New Year's Eve, which makes it really memorable. But it's also really close to Christmas, which means that I don't have a lot of turnaround time for buying her a gift. I have to come up with something for Christmas, and then a week later have a quality birthday gift as well. So I thought that I would forego the usual last-minute type of approach that I've adopted the last few years, and I tried to get a head start this year. I was struck by inspiration as I was scrolling my life away on Instagram. I saw a picture from an artist that I know she likes, and I thought a print of their work would be perfect. So I went to their page, only to discover that they don't sell prints of their work. And I was annoyed. How could an artist not sell some of their work for me to buy? And it's in moments like that that I recognize that our culture is not one that is oriented around the idea of Sabbath. We have a culture that tells us that we need to monetize every moment and activity in our lives. We need to be working constantly, and if we have a hobby, we need to find a way to monetize it. If we don't, then we're perceived as being lazy. Against this relentless drive from our culture, we're invited to live according to an alternative rhythm of life, which is that of Sabbath. Instead of submitting our lives to the grind that threatens to consume us, we can seek wholeness as people made in the image of God, people who seek to model their lives after the example of Jesus. We can participate in Sabbath for ourselves as we reject the demands of culture and rest to allow ourselves to heal physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. We can participate in Sabbath for the creation as we seek to live in such a way as to allow it to heal from all the damage that we have and continue to do to it. We can participate in Sabbath for others as we bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, and free the oppressed. Dr. Richard Middleton wrote, "The message of the kingdom that Jesus brings is good news most fundamentally because we, no less than his original hearers, desperately need the healing and redemption that he came to bring, a redemption that touches all that we do." Power in our culture is often equated with those who work the most, who enrich themselves the most. But God calls us to a different rhythm of life, one of Sabbath, one of rest, one of wholeness.